gave the talk, I gave the title as the Tianxia and the time, or the propensity of time, because actually, as Professor Wilder already showed, that the great transformation of that idea, or together with Confucianism and Buddhism and so on and so forth. But that eventually I changed title, the Tianxia as a trans-systemic society, actually as well as a trans-societal system. And a little bit explanation for this, because since the beginning of this century, we talk so much about the empire, tributary system, or under the heaven, civilizational state, and so on and so forth, which also echoed and responded to the discussions in different places. And the reemergence of these concepts or the categories stems from the dissatisfaction with the nation-state paradigm, obviously. So that's why we try to see, started from the idea of the all under the heaven or Tianxia, to seek for some alternatives for the contemporary world. But sometimes we always try to define, in many cases, not all, but we put that discussion on Tianxia or the empire, civilizational state in the binary of these concepts and the nation states. So that's why I try to use some term, maybe temporal, the choice to see that. So for me, what is the trans-systemic society, 跨体系社会? As they are spread out across a region, families, villages, and rural urban communities often contain different social systems, whether in terms of ethnicity, religion, language, social customs, to the extent that we can say that these systems are embedded in a society, a village, a family, or even a person. In the writing and the compilation of history using an ethnic group or a religion, a village or family, then this narrative approach may result in the diminishment, overstatement, or distortion of these complex relationships. For me, the trans-systemic society encompasses these unique historic phenomena that are often overlooked or simplified by modern knowledge, and thus offers the possibility of redescribing these phenomena. So obviously, this concept has several similarities to the idea of plurality in unity, or the unity of plurality proposed by Fei Xiaotong. But his concept is a narrative limited to the territories of modern China at that time that needs to be expanded and revised for today. The first, I think, its emphasis on the intermingling of Chinese societies and the internal diversity of the whole trans-systemic society overlaps in some places with concept of plurality in unity, but it's not limited to the categories of nation or the ethnicity. What the concept of trans-systemic society provides is a mutually connected social and political form that arises through the interaction, transmission, and the coexistence of different cultures, ethnic groups, and regions, which can provide a sense of commonality based on the social solidarity that serve as a basis for a process of continuous socialization. The second, a classical nationalist discourse often sees the unification of political and cultural borders as a characteristic of the so-called nation state. However, if one is to speak of the unification of political and cultural borders, the precondition for these must be that trans-systemic societies and their definition of culture themselves have led to the unity of culture and the political borders. In trans-systemic societies, culture is necessarily political, and its borders are necessarily ambiguous, often beyond the scope of political. The basis for a trans-systemic society is found in the interconnectedness of the world of everyday life, but it also relies on a continuously evolving political culture that integrates the elements of various systems within shifting organic connections without denying the uniqueness and agency of these elements. So China obviously is a continuously emerging trans-civilizational, just to me, the civilization, because you can say that the Tibetan culture is a civilization, Islamic culture is a civilization. But China, when we talk about Chinese civilizations, these were internal. So internalizes and takes on the traces of other while maintaining its own unique vitality. For these reasons, however, trans-systemic society is interrelated with and mutually defined by trans-societal systems, 跨社会体系, that's different societies linked together. We see not only examples from earlier historical periods of the adaptation of both Buddhism and Islam to China, but also examples in a modern period of adaptation of various modes of thought, institutions, and the social organization derived from the West, including the Marxism, for example, while the influence on other societies of Chinese cultural traditions and experiences in modern times has likewise undergone a process of intersection, intermingling, and the localization and the creative transformation. So the plurality in unity is a global phenomenon, not just a Chinese one, and the concept is not sufficient to explain the question of what makes China China. What makes China China? If we move away from the continuous process of becoming China, in Chinese, I use that the translation, the 中国化, and the many changes in the political culture that has so deeply influenced the process that it becomes difficult to explain China's enduring vitality. This political culture, as it transformed across history, has continued to overcome the contradictions and the conflicts of trans-systemic societies, and as the nature of the political subject changed, to construct and reconstruct China's continuity. It is these unique historical phenomena that has given rise to debate about the rupture and the continuity of Chinese history and how to understand the plurality of China and its historical formation. The most recent discussion of the New Qing history and its significance for understanding the process of Hanhua and the Huhua, so-called the becoming Han or the Hanification and the foreignization, touched off a controversy that continues to this day and goes far beyond the influence of this line of scholarship in the United States. On this issue, it is impossible to draw meaningful conclusions if we cannot go beyond the dualistic historical view of becoming Han, Hanhua, and Huhua, foreignization, and arrive at a new interpretation of becoming China, 中国化, as a historical process. In Chinese, the 中国化 and the Hanhua are very different concepts. The former refers to the dynamic process of China's formation, in which different ethnic groups and cultures interact and connect with one another as part of this dynamic process, and from different orientations advance China's continuous emergence and changing. This was and is a hybrid, multi-directional process. As for the later, the becoming Han or Hanhua is often understood and translated as Sinicization and used alongside the term assimilation to emphasize the assimilation of other ethnic groups and cultures by the Han as a primary nationality. In Chinese, the concepts as the 中国, Han, and the Hua carried different meanings and values, but under the influence of early modern European nationalist knowledge, the Western idea of 中国, the China, was so marked by the ethno-nationalism that whenever 中国化, becoming China, was translated into other language, it was all too easily equated with Hanhua, the becoming Han or Sinicization. As a result, in English or other Western languages, the concept of Hanhua is indistinguishable from and often translated as a concept of the sinicization, to the point that the subtle yet meaningful differences between them disappear. So because the sinicization serves as a standard translation of for Hanhua, then the process of Zhonghua is often understood as a process of the Han absorbing and assimilating other cultures, completely ignoring that in the historical formation of China, different peoples and cultures have all served the important functions, as well as the fact that the supreme rulers of the dynasties, such as the Yuan and the Qing dynasties, were not Han at all. So understand China as a trans-systemic society, therefore, it is important to go beyond the conceptual framework of the ethno-nationalism, but in the English-speaking world, what should be used to explain the term 中国化, if not the concept of sinicization? So this is a question. So I think that there were 4 reasons. I just no time to then for transposing the 中国化 to explain the rupture and the continuities in Chinese history. The first, after their entry into the Central Plains, the northern peoples sought to establish their legitimacy on the genealogy of Chinese dynasties while maintaining their own national identity. This identification was active, and the concept of Hanhua, which often connotes a passive process, is not sufficient to describe it. The second, 中国化 of these dynasties was neither a single process of integration nor a one-way process of conquest. It involved a complex relationship of recognition. That is a multiple recognition process. The third, 中国化 was also based on a migration, intermarriage, changes in custom, and adjustments to institutions that occurred within the dynasty, along with other social changes in the daily life. So that, I think, all of these phenomena are common in world history. And in Chinese history, these changes and integration also included localized instances of Islamization, Buddhification, Mongolization, Manchurification, and Hanhua, as well as a process of localization in different regions. So that's the fourth. It is for these reasons, 中国化 does not imply that China is a monolithic. This is a trans-systemic society that is a political entity that is trans-ethnic, trans-religious, translingual, and even trans-civilizational. And its political unity is always premised on its trans-systemicity. Trans-systemicity means that the one contains the essence of the many, and that many is the organic substance of the one. Not only are ethnic groups, religions, and so on trans-systemic, but all social bodies, such as villages, families, and individuals also possess the characteristics of the trans-systemic. So, so how to, I want to maybe 2 minutes to highlight the one issue. The Wang has offered an insight. He said that Christianity transcends the political boundaries of European states, while Confucianism fuses the culture and the political into a single, though complex, compound. Were we to grant the premise that the fusion of politics and the culture is a unique feature of modern nationalism, we would face the awkward dilemma of the treating imperial Chinese state-making strategies as modern. However, the key question that cannot be avoided here is how to understand the Confucianism. Is it a political culture that can be reconciled with other ideas and values, or is it a relative homogeneous value system? Because concepts such as Confucian culture and even Chinese civilization tend to become homogenized in our everyday life since the end of the 19th century. But these but the question arises of how to interpret the non-Confucian culture systems in Chinese society. This was especially true in the Qing dynasty from the 18th century onward. The Qing dynasty's grand unification was centered on the Confucian culture, but was not established on the basis of a homogeneous or single culture, religion, or even civilization. On the contrary, the Qing dynasty was a transcultural, trans-religious, and a trans-civilizational, trans-systemic society. It both contained multiple systems and form a flexible, resilient society. For the central plans, so these are in this sense, it is not Confucian thought alone, but rather a political culture that can integrate the Chinese Confucian tradition, Tibetan Buddhism, Islamic culture, and other systems to achieve a certain unity between the culture and the political boundaries, thus continuously expanding the connotation and the denotation of the concept of China. The political culture of the Qing dynasty resulted from the operations of interaction between the multiple cultures. From this perspective, it was trans-systemic society as the defining of culture itself that lead to the unification of culture and the political boundaries. In a trans-systemic society, culture is necessary, political. The last sentence maybe, the Confucian culture couldn't articulate sufficiently in the unification of the political and the cultural domain under the Qing dynasty. But when it comes to bring together the rich threads of Chinese society, there is no doubt about the dominant role that Confucian culture played in dynastic politics. For Confucian thinkers, politics is the act of process of ritual, and its ideal function is to create a common world that is also homogeneous in its diversity. So if the Confucian thought was dominant in the Qing dynasty, it was precisely because Confucian thought possesses a deeper political nature and is adapted as serving as a go-between or intermediary, weaving other systems into a flexible, resilient network without denying the uniqueness of these systems. So Confucian society does not require other parts or the completely or the other regions to regulate their own social relations according to the Confucian ethnic political principles and the relation, but also left open the possibility of flexible interpretation of this relationship by other communities. So in that sense, the boundaries of culture and the political border not necessarily only unification. If you see the surrounding area, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, those Confucian cultures, not necessarily within the border of Chinese political culture. So that's and inside of China, you still contain different cultures within through the threads of the flexible, the Confucian practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Any questions or comments? Professor Park.
Yes, thank you very much for the exciting paper. I think I understood the Tianxia better after I read your paper and heard your talk than the book itself. Here, I really like the idea of thinking Tianxia really as all-inclusive, even though the Tianxia itself means that, right? Everything under the heaven, but that is not reality. So my question has to do with really the gap. So when we talk about Tianxia as the everything under the heaven, we virtually means that everything under the heaven, and that is a kind of our idea. Whereas reality, does not always mean that everything is everything. Everybody does not mean everybody. So one of the major kind of job for us to do, not only philosophers, but politicians, and to bridge the gap between the two, right? So I always think that idealism has a reason to exist. So here's an ideal that we think about Tianxia, whereas in the world, in reality, Tianxia, the world is not the same world. The world I live and the world someone else live, they are not the same. And then in the Tianxia book, the author constantly talk about internalization of the world. Whose world do you internalize, right? So what would you say about this gap between the two? And you talk a lot about the Confucianism. What kind of role the Confucianism play, if that is your kind of idea about bridging the gap between the world that we dream of at Tianxia and the world we live?
Yes, thank you. That's why I think it's a very important question, because for me, the idea of Tianxia is always in the transformation. It's partly because that's why at the beginning I suggest the title of my presentation will be the Tianxia and the propensity of time, or the time. So it's a great transformation. It's really identified our world. So in the later Qing period, for example, the Confucian Wei tried to use his theory of Gongyang theory to cover the whole world as all under the heaven. But before that, like in the 19th century, early 19th century, Gong Zizhen even thought that his discovery of Western region as part of Tianxia is already a new discovery for intelligentsia from the inland China. So that's always changed together. This is the one aspect. Second aspect, I think, of course, we talk about the Confucian idea of Tianxia. The different cultures have their own concept about the world, all under the heaven. And what made, I think that at least for my understanding, the Confucian idea that to some extent, they give the space for the interpretation, flexible interpretation about the other cultures. So when to explain the relationship, it became flexible. So I remember that, for example, the Joseph Fletcher wrote the very interesting paper before to talk about the exchange and the letters between the Ming Emperor and the Dalai Lama. Obviously, the 2 pages at the beginning of the letter was all the titles. Each showed that the respect for each other. So should that relationship show certain kind of the flexible interpretation about other, and through that to redefine ourselves. So that gave you the possibility from within that the framework of the Tianxia. So these are, I think, is more interesting for me.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah. Hi. Professor Sim?
Thanks
Yeah,
so
May.
much,
Yes.
Professor Wang, for your talk. And I am very sympathetic with your view about the unity between the cultural and political. But even when it comes to Confucianism, there is this exclusion of certain cultures, right? So in the Analects, he talks about, accepting certain music as beautiful, certain rituals, but, not others. So there is always this, right, culture that defines a particular political regime. And that seems to be, the case with China today as well, trying to assimilate them into a more Sinitic culture. So what I'm wondering what you make of that, the whole point of, right, a culture excluding others instead of, uniting with them and doing so politically.
Yeah, all the cultures have that dimensions. Otherwise, it's difficult to talk about the 以下之辩, the distinction between 以 and 下, the foreign and inside from the beginning. But that relations were in the history, at least in the Confucian ideas like in Dong Zhong Shu or New Confucianism and so on. So through the struggles between the different schools, you see that more or less the more flexible relations follow up that process. As for the discrimination, not necessarily only for the Confucianism, because in modern times, we shaped by 19th, 20th century, the political culture, not necessarily only because of the Confucianism. Actually, the emphasis on this strict distinction between 以 and 下 in a later change was a response to the Western nationalism rather than the continuation of the old Confucian values. So in terms of the discourse of the Confucianism, but actually that was another version of the modern nationalism. It's like a 19th century 朱子学 would serve as a certain kind of the nationalism in Japan. So in that way, we also need to rethink about the impact of the modern time, especially the 20th century, 19th, 20th century, reshaped the political cultures. So these are different. So it is not necessarily only folks, even they use the term of Confucianism or some others to define the cultural identity. That part, so obviously, is true. There was a conflict. The Professor Walter also mentioned that the new Confucianism in the Song Dynasty, there was we know the confrontation between the Buddhism, Taoism, and the Confucianism that show their own identities. That's part of that. So in any case, when we talk about the contemporary phenomena, it's not necessarily only goes back to the tradition, but rethink about the modern times, how that the modern times reshaped that tradition.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Perfect type